Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here with us today. We have a very important topic to discuss, which, as I was saying to the panelists earlier, first came on my radar as a discussion topic in live programming 20 years ago. I have a degree in engineering. I didn't go into engineering, and there are very good reasons I didn't go into engineering, because it didn't seem to me somewhere that was necessarily welcoming to women. So now I get to talk about it, which is second best, I guess. But in those 20 years, it seems to me that the dial has not moved as much as I would expect it to. And the reasons for that are many. One of them is that I think the problem is slightly more complicated, perhaps, than we thought it was. And also, I think there is an element of there's always another pressing problem, isn't there, to deal with, many of them that we've heard talked about this morning. But if we want pressing problems to be dealt with, we need to be able to source the best talent to think through those problems. So this problem of gender equality is now a very pressing one. So what I'm going to do is ask each individual panelist, who I know have quite separate points to bring to this panel, a little bit of their view, and then we'll move on to the discussion. So Harriet, if I may, I'd like to start with you, and what your experience or how you see this problem of gender equality or women being represented in the workforce.
So I think there are a couple of things that are very urgent, not just for this room, but for the discussions that I hope ensue after it. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be representing a company like IBM, who's been at the inclusion and diversity for over 100 years. And here in Asia-Pac, we have 45% of our executives are women. But there are three issues, we believe, that are hugely holding us back from progress. The first is, we surveyed thousands of companies for International Women's Day, and a very small percentage of the companies have a plan for inclusion and diversity. You know, you have a plan for sustainability, for EV and AV, but here in region, actually having an inclusion and diversity plan, metrics, targets, you know, the psychology, the physiology, and the anatomy to make it happen just doesn't exist. Secondly, role modeling. You know, we have found in the war for talent, one of the things that makes us able to attract the very best is that people look at the top of the corporation and say, we have a female chairman and CEO, we have 4 women on the board, the head of Asia-Pac, the head of ASEAN, 4 of the 5 heads of the ASEAN countries are women. And it means then that they say, this is something I don't have to worry about. In their own companies, maybe they've been looked over once or twice, and here, if they're good, they will get on. And so this role modeling issue is very, very important. And then thirdly, and I think we'll get into this separately, the whole issue in the region of the world where so much development is done for the world, that the unconscious bias, the coding, we're not going to change that by goodwill and a few great leaders. That has to be institutionalized and addressed. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that, as it's very key here, particularly in India.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think also we want to come back to the issue of why this is important too. And Harriet, I know, has some very clear views on what it does to the bottom line to have a diversified workforce. How do you measure this, though? You know, how do you work out how you're doing on this front? Quite difficult sometimes to get hold of, but Peter, I know you have some ideas.
So the first thing that I want to talk about is the panels that have been giving presentations all day. There are 7 panels. There are 2 panels that have women on them. The numbers, and as we say at Bloomberg, if you don't have the numbers, you can't measure it and you can't manage it. That means 28% of the panels have women on it. If we look out across this floor, there are remarkably few women or people of color. I think aspirationally it's something that the summit should be thinking about in future summits to better reflect exactly what we're all trying to accomplish. With that brief introduction, I'll piggyback a little bit off what Harriet said. We are in a global war for talent, number one. Number two, it has been well documented that the more diverse and inclusive a workforce or team of workers, the better decisions, the better performance get made. We all need to, I think, absorb those remarks, that data, and understand that from a leadership point of view, it's got to come from the top of the organizations. People have to be held accountable. We can do a much better job with that kind of dedication, that kind of leadership.
Peter, thank you very much. Indra, come to you as a lady who broke many glass ceilings and really pushed some boundaries. Why? Given that the case is there on so many levels to get more diversity, and as part of that, more women, why is it that we are doing quite a lousy job of shifting that dial? After all, something like 5 or 6% of companies in the US and Europe have CEOs at their helm. And I think in Asia, you know, it's very varied according to what country you're talking about. But really, we're not doing well broadly, are we?
So thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's great to be a retired CEO on a panel about women. And I think this is about the 10th panel I'm doing on women in the last 3 or 4 months. So I'm an expert on this topic. Let me talk a little bit about this. We've been talking about this issue for over a decade or more. And it's the same issue that keeps coming up over and over and over again. We are making progress. I'm not saying we're making no progress, but it's glacial, the progress. So I want to perhaps segment this issue and talk about it in a more segmented way, because I think this issue does require us to talk about the issue in a more nuanced way. I'm a boomer. When I came into the workforce, there were barely any women in the workforce. I remember meetings I was in. I was the only woman in the meeting, and I was the oddity. For so many reasons, I was an odd person. And I had to claw my way up the organization. I had to perform better than everybody else because I was a woman, I was an immigrant, a person of color, everything. But it was a different set of rules that I played with. And there are very few of us boomers who've made it to be CEOs of companies. And that's why if you look at the Fortune 500, there's a very small percentage of women who've made it to the CEO ranks. Our time is behind us. Let's now get to the Gen Xers. There's a lot of women, a lot of talent in the Gen X population. But they are not being advanced at the level they should be advanced. Because people are putting on a diversity pair of glasses as opposed to the best talent pair of glasses. If you look at all the people in your organization and say, I want the best talent to bubble up to the top, there'll be a lot more women that bubble up to the top. So people in power who are making the decisions on who should be moved up ought to stop thinking about quotas for women. They should stop thinking about the fact that women are different. They should in fact be saying, how do I take the best women or best people and move them to the top? We just saw statistics that said companies with women in senior positions do way better than companies that don't have women in senior positions. Investors should be demanding that women are put in senior positions if those numbers are true. If those numbers are true. Why that's not happening is because I believe we haven't yet educated people in power to really look at your talent base in a gender-neutral way. And that's something that we need to do.
So we need to put talent glasses on, rather we need to be taught probably how to do that. But to your point, Harriet, you said you used the expression unconscious bias, and I know you want to talk more about that. We all have that. We're human, aren't we? So how do we stop that?
Yeah, I think we've gone deeply into the human reactions. I think it's more than educating those in power. There are definable reactions that people have. The unconscious bias is every one of us may have it. It may be unconscious, it may be conscious. I'll give you an example of something for myself. But having studied this and trained and helped the organization, and many organizations that I've worked for, the skills, the training, the mindset to understand how you react and behave to other women, to people from a background that you don't particularly like. I'm lucky enough to work in 15 countries here, and a country that I always have a tougher time in, actually our own female representation at executive level in Korea is very high, 35%. The norm is closer to 2. But a couple of days in Korea, I'm feeling a little invisible. I'm feeling a lot of reactions. And quite recently, I was at a meeting, mixed, great people, the very best flourishing in IBM in Korea. And a young man was presenting. And he was quintessentially Korean in every sense, but his English was just not as good as the others, and he was taking a while, and I was impatient. And in that split second, I had a moment to express that in such a way that everyone in the room saw my reaction, or to demonstrate a level of empathy and respect for the fact that he is very different. We were, through my mind mapping, touching on a series of biases, and I had the opportunity to encourage him, take your time, you know, you want to hear my Korean, it's pretty appalling. And then at the end of the meeting, he said to me, you know, I am taking English lessons, and thank you for that support. So I think this issue of unconscious bias that all of us have, and building that into our understanding for inclusion. Because I think the big issue in the workplace is inclusion, that people can bring 150% of themselves because of who they are. Age, sex, color, creed, sexuality, physical ability. And recently, here in Singapore, I received a lot of feedback that we were not being particularly inclusive of the large population of single men and women who look after and care for their parents as a very primary role besides working for us. So I tend to apply this inclusion lens, and you know, unconscious bias isn't something that everyone else has, and we great business leaders don't. I think it's very important to think about that.
Peter, we've talked about putting the right set of glasses on, or the lenses or whatever, but also you, I know, in the way that you assess your workforce, make it part of the metric, don't you?
Yeah, we have 19 separate business units, and each business unit presents a diversity and inclusion plan to me at the beginning of the year, and then we do a 6-month review, and to the extent it's appropriate, we have interim reviews depending on performance from each one of those review dates. We focus on recruitment, we focus on retention, we focus on development, and we focus on kind of an all other category of show me your best ideas, try them, let's see how they go. If we get some results from them, let's socialize them across the firm and kind of try and innovate a little bit on the fly. We also, in addition to holding our managers accountable, now basically build that into their performance evaluation. We're beginning to address compensation based on how they do from a D&I perspective. Again, back to the point that I made before, it's all because we're in a global war for talent. We want the best people we can possibly get. But as has been said by Harriet and Indra, what we're also trying to do at the same time is create the best work environment that we possibly can, so that people can bring their whole selves to work. They can feel that they're being rewarded for the work that they do and can behave and perform the way they want to behave and make the kind of contributions at the end will keep them in good stead with us as colleagues.
Yes, so there are some very practical measures that one needs to take in a workplace if you're going to encourage women to not just in, but also to stay. And I'm talking now about children. I was a banker. I told this story before I became a broadcaster. And I was working at a German bank in Frankfurt, and I was in my 20s at that point and was not planning on having children, but I remember there was an inquiry that went round, and I worked in there weren't women around basically where I worked, and there was an inquiry saying, do you think we need childcare here for, children of workers, and the response from my male colleagues was absolutely not. There's no requirement from that. So there wasn't really a great deal of forward thinking as to how they would encourage women to not just come into the workplace, but also to stay there. Women sometimes also have what is known, I think, as imposter syndrome. Sometimes women think that they are not capable of doing something, whereas a man with the same skills would feel that he probably could give that extra 10% that was required that he didn't quite have on paper. Indra, your feeling is that the millennials that we're getting through now don't suffer from that problem.
Well, I want to pick up where Peter left off. Peter, I agree with you that there's a war for talent, and we ought to hire the best and brightest and promote the best and the brightest. What we shouldn't say is we want to hire the best and the brightest as long as they're men. We want to promote the best and the brightest as long as they're men. I think that's what's happening today. And I think especially the people in power, whoever they are, men or women, have got to stop saying we want people just like us to be moved to the next level. And we've really got to look at the performance of people in an objective way. And I don't believe that's happening. Because if it were happening, then we'd be having a lot more women in the workforce, because the numbers show that if you have more women, you perform better as a company. Investors should be demanding that there are more women in the workforce, in senior positions, and it's not happening. So there's some sort of a gap between the say and the do, and we have to figure out how to bridge that. But let's talk about the millennials. As I look at the millennial generation and the Gen Zs, the people following them, the women are driven, they are wicked smart. I saw a statistic which said in certain countries, in the United States, 57% of the top grades are gotten by women coming out of colleges. At MIT, 53% of the graduating seniors from the engineering school are women. 70% of high school valedictorians are women. So you've got a generation where the women are driven, they want economic security, they want financial security, they want to really make it in whatever profession they take on. And nothing is going to hold them back. And if we want that generation to rule the world going forward, people in power, especially the Gen Xers who will be in power at that time, have to change how you evaluate the women, how you promote them, how you think about talent, because you're going to have so many women that are going to be so damn smart that you can't run business without them. We talked about the digital divide just now and not having enough people. Just put all the women to work who are so smart. You will not have a digital divide problem. If 53% of the MIT grads are engineers, where have all the women gone? Obviously, somewhere in the workforce, they're being spit out. So I think it's time we really came to terms with these issues and said, who do we need to educate? Who are the people in power? Who do we need to educate? And how do we get them to put on these I want the best talent glasses?
Harriet, it's about developing, and by the way, please send your questions in via the app. We've got a question here about developing the ecosystem, meaning presumably getting people into the pipeline. And as you've pointed out, Indra, it's a question of keeping them in the pipeline, because the pipeline is somehow leaky. How do you fix that problem?
So I think at the very start, the work that we do around skills, we have a responsibility if we're talking about countries where we have enough people getting educated. Our work around STEM at scale in India, getting more women with the STEM skills. But, the skills that the world needs, the hot skills, digital, architect, as well as the people skills, being agile, etc., extending those skills so that people have the opportunity to acquire the skills that the world needs. I think that the lack of leadership around very simple problems like helping women stay in the pipeline. We were discussing this morning something that is extensively used around the world at IBM, which is not exactly like putting someone on the moon, but works for thousands and thousands of women. Two parts to the issue of a woman having a child, one who wants to go back out and work, but is still breastfeeding. And we have very simple mechanisms that allows the breastfeeding mother to express the milk. It's shipped straight to the baby. They can carry on doing their job. If they want to have the child with them, it's not that hard to provide simple benefits for the carer. So when people say, well, how do we really keep people in the workforce? These are not quantum physics types of problems. These require people in a room who know what it is they'd like to do, and those that say, sure, we can fix that. So I think there has to be creativity, energy, and commitment to do that. Culturally, it will be different. I think all of us are struggling to do this at the right scale if India is to be, if it is to be the century of India. But across Asia-Pac, all of these initiatives designed to support and enable those. And I think the issue that we've learned, particularly in this region, it's the lifetime support for a woman. My youngest is in the audience today, and she was a dream until she was 15, and then she went she's okay now, so. But, you need support when they're little, when they're medium, when they're, aging. In my own case, where my mom is regularly setting fire to her little house that she refuses to move, and I need to give time and energy and support at that point. So a lifetime of support is not just a woman's issue, it's also a man's, but it's not that hard for a company to provide that support. And I'm very proud that IBM does it. Sorry, Peter.
No, Harry, excuse me for starting too quickly. One of the things we have, based on our founder and our founding shareholders, a pretty rigid culture about flexibility, which we are in the process of changing.
You have a rigid culture about flexibility. Is that what you said?
Rigid culture about not having flexibility. We have a badge system. Everybody is supposed to be at work by 8. You can't go until 6 at night, and so forth and so on. And that's been a significant barrier from a female colleague perspective, particularly going through these life issues. And so we have a big push on to basically exhibit much more flexibility, and in exhibiting that flexibility, make just basic common sense judgments about individual needs. The more of which we do, the better off we're going to be, because we're going to retain our talent longer. And I think sometimes we lose sight of these pretty simplistic issues and changes that we can implement to make the environment the kind of welcoming place that you want it to be, so people decide that they want to extend their careers as opposed to go someplace else.
There's a question here about whether Western-founded companies are getting more momentum behind inclusivity than those in ASEAN. Is that the case?
I don't know.
I
think,
think,
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, please, please.
I mean, certainly in our own businesses in ASEAN, being culturally respectful to the different needs of Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines. I mean, Philippines, on the sheer numbers, leads in terms of women in business and positions of responsibility, and have created an infrastructure that works. So actually, our metrics and our inclusivity as we measure it, and the number of people of different backgrounds running parts of ASEAN actually are some of the best in our world.
It is also the case, of course, that sometimes societies don't necessarily support women progressing because they expect them to perform a lot of domestic duties too. I remember a friend of mine who's quite senior in a financial organization calling a man in who was about to go on paternity leave, so they got that far, and she said to him, so what do you plan to do? Remember, for this baby, what you're going to have to do is prepare food every day and all of this kind of thing, and put it in the freezer, and she was talking about and he said, no, I won't be doing that because my wife likes to do that at the weekend. So, and here's a hint, she probably doesn't, but in the domestic environment, it is often expected that a woman fulfills that sort of role. And that's also difficult, isn't it? That you can't very easily reach out in society and change those things, or can you? Are role models an important role in terms of changing perceptions in wider society?
I think it's here from the work that we've done. If you can see it, you can be it. That is so powerful, I think, across not just gender. And so, it removes this sense of doubt that some unconscious bias or prejudice exists. And we see it allows us to attract the best and they flourish. And that's not just women. So I think that little sentence, that symbolism of role models is so important, and how those role models treat each other.
Yes.
And how we network together and show the support and share the stories of what works. That is so meaningful, I think.
I have a poll, which I should have asked earlier on, but I haven't, but I'm going to do it now. Do you agree the setting of gender quotas on boards at the executive levels by policymakers is an effective way to foster women's leadership? So this is a question about quotas. Is that an effective way of moving the dial? Ooh, so agree and not sure. Nobody disagrees. That's interesting. I would like to bet that 10 years ago, that may not have been the case. Just a brief thought. Are we done?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so just a brief thought. This is the music going. Brief thought on what that poll tells us. Anybody? Would it have been the same answer 10 years ago?
Probably skewed slightly differently.
Skewed slightly differently. Well, perhaps we're moving something then. To our panelists, thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.